Good morning, good afternoon again, colleagues. Thank you for joining us on this webinar talking about disaster risk and recovery by the heritage sector. This is a collaborative webinar between the Museums Association of the Caribbean and the Caribbean, which is the Caribbean Association of, I keep forgetting, I sincerely apologies, but the Caribbean branch of the International Council of Archives, Caribbean Heritage Emergency Network. And the goal of this webinar today is really for us to talk about some of the pressing issues around climate change and crisis and recovery in the region. We have colleagues who are currently preparing for the current tropical storm that's supposed to hit Bermuda as a category 1, 2, category 2 or 3. And so we constantly have to be abreast of what's happening. So we have some basic guidelines for today's webinar. I'm going to ask all of you to mute your mics and turn off your cameras. The only person who is supposed to have on the camera is the person who is presenting. Our order, it would be our welcome from Max, my colleague at Carbico. And then Lourdes from MAC is going to present or introduce our speakers with the bio. And we'll have our presenters. We're going to invite you to put your questions in the chat. And for those of us behind the scenes, we will be monitoring them. Okay, Max, I turn over to you.
Thank you very much, Shani, and welcome to our first webinar, a first joint webinar. I have to find my text. It's the first joint webinar from CARBICA, the Caribbean branch of the International Council on Archives, and MAC, the Museum Association of the Caribbean, on disaster response in our Caribbean region, and it's an honor to open it today. We think it's important to join forces between different heritage sectors to safeguard our collections and to work together between all heritage sectors. We live in small communities scattered across a vast area in an island region with various natural hazards, as Shani has said, hurricanes amongst them. In such a situation, exchanging expertise and forming networks creates a synergy and added values. Networks amongst institutions and countries is not enough, though. Energizing local stakeholders is important. Trying to connect to local government, include heritage and national disaster plans, is also key. Proper tools. Monitoring and alarming tools can help. For example, the mapping tools that will be presented in this webinar. It's a tool to geolocate your collections and sites in a digital map, and it has it's very important to do so. We are in the process to better organize a disaster response mechanism in the region and function as a hub in the worldwide cultural emergency response system. The presentations today will be testimony of this. I wish you all an excellent webinar, and I hope you will be energized and join our efforts safeguarding our cultural properties.
Thank you, Max. For this webinar, we have the participation of these wonderful panelists, Halcyon, Andrea, and Rita. For presenter number 1, Halcyon Whitshire Busby. She's on the campus. She's the campus record manager and head archivist based at the University of the West Indies, UWI, Cave Hill campus. She currently oversees the archives and records management functions with the Registry Record Services, Record Center, and the West Indies Federal Archive Center Cave Hill Campus Archive, WIFAC, under her purview. She's also the coordinator of the certificates in record management at the campus. She has received training in first aid to culture in times of crisis and at the International Center for the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, ICCROM. Her work thus far has led to her recent appointment to chair of the International Council on Archive, ICA, expert group on archive buildings and environment. She's also co-chair of the Caribbean Heritage Emergency Network. Presenter number 2 will be Andrea Richards. She's a public archaeologist and heritage in emergencies specialist. Andrea is a Caribbean public archaeologist presently working at the regional and international levels on various initiatives targeting natural and cultural heritage being impacted by climate-induced and other natural hazards, the safeguarding of living heritage in emergencies, and the synergies which exist between the tangible and the intangible, and in how islanders of the Caribbean respond to severe environment change. She is an associate fellow at the KITLV Royal Netherlands Institute of the CE, Asian and Caribbean Studies, and is presently undertaking doctoral research on cultural heritage pathways and climate action. Andrea is also a UNESCO expert for heritage in emergency and has supported various countries across Latin America and the Caribbean and Southern Africa in undertaking post-disaster needs assessment and recovery planning for the culture sector in response to disasters. She's also recently supported UNESCO in the development of disaster recovery framework guidelines for the global cultural sector. Presenter number 3 will be Rita Tijan Fu, is the director of the National Archives Suriname and part-time lecturer at the History Department of the Antoine de Kom University of Suriname. She is actively involved in the preservation of the national documentary heritage and involved in large digitization projects. Currently, she is co-chair of the Caribbean Heritage Emergency Network, CHEN, and subsidiary of the Caribbean branch of the International Council on Archive, CARBICA. Rita Tijan Fu was actively involved in the launch of CHEN in 2019, advocating for regional approach on disaster preparedness and recovery in the regional, as well as collaboration between the heritage sector and the disaster management agencies. Together with the CARBICA executive, she has been working on the establishment of the Cultural Emergency Response, CER, hub for the Caribbean region, which was launched in March 2024 in Curacao. Halcyon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. Let's see. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Just trying to get it.
You're going to switch to presenter mode?
Yeah, I'm going to switch to presenter mode. It's good. All right. Are you all seeing? Oh, it jumped all the way there. Okay. Is it in presenter mode? It's okay?
No, it's not in presenter.
Oh no. Why not?
Do you want to stop share and try again?
Yeah, we'll try again and see.
Okay.
Now? Is it there?
Well, we're seeing your screen. You want, well, okay, why not proceed?
Okay, all right.
It's not in presenter mode, but you can proceed.
All right, guys. So thank you very much for the introduction. And what I'm going to present today is on, as expressed before, I am a cultural first aider and also an archivist by profession. I would have received my training from ICRAM as a cultural first aider. That's the International Center for the Study of Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property. This training would have involved looking at and dealing with how we deal with cultural heritage in times of disaster. So you're talking about intangible cultural heritage and also tangible cultural heritage. It also, the framing of that particular course of study looked at various types of rules of engagement in terms of looking at the different sectors that could actually impact on cultural heritage. So looking at things like from the humanitarian sector, persons within the heritage sector, talking about galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, if we're looking at the GLAMS perspective. Additionally, ensuring that our first responders also get an understanding of the need to actually or be sensitized to the need to actually save our cultural heritage. And some countries in Europe have actually, taken that as, part and parcel of their comprehensive overview in terms of creating a context of saving their cultural heritage, and Italy being one of the countries that spearheads in terms of that. So this is where we're going with this morning. So what I'm going to be talking about is the disaster that took place at the Barbados Department of Archives and the lessons that we could learn from this in terms of the recovery and the response, and the recovery is still ongoing.
Sorry, Halcyon, I'm so sorry to jump back in.
Uh-huh.
Okay, you're showing, what we're seeing is your view, the person
Oh.
on the back end, not the presentation view that everybody is supposed to see. So I don't know if you just quickly want to stop share, reshare, into presenter mode, and then reshare.
Okay, let's see.
Yes, that's right. Okay, I'm giving you back 15 seconds. Go ahead.
Okay, that's all right. Thank you. So just giving you, this just gives you, so I've kind of collated here what happened on the 18th of June 2024, that fateful morning. So what would have happened? A fire would have started as a result of lightning actually striking the building of one of the repositories of the Barbados Department of Archives. So if you can see in the photograph there, this is the block that was actually impacted. It's a 2-story structure, and a number of records were impacted. The only thing I could say, thankfully, that happened as a result, it did not spread to other blocks. To give a history of the plant within itself, this particular plant was, in the early part of the 20th century, was a leprosarium, and the coral stone would have been used to actually build the hospital at the time. So you could imagine, essentially, we've been through the COVID pandemic, and we've had satellite sites and so forth. So this area was essentially the site of the leprosarium outbreak, the leprosy outbreak, sorry, of that particular time. The building is very strong. The walls are actually still standing. And if you can see the picture there on the left, the right-hand side of the burnt part of the building, there was actually a hurricane rod. But the hurricane rod within itself was not, and that hurricane rod was there for almost, definitely about over 80 years. But it didn't do its job. And the incident of this nature underscores the importance that needs to be held on as it relates to protecting our heritage. It's the records that were impacted, some of them dated from the 17th century all up until the modern era. So looking at records that would have been impacted from all the 1960s and so forth. So what I want to state is, ironically, in March of 2024, this year, we would have had an exercise that was done in conjunction with the Ministry of Culture here in Barbados and the UNESCO Cluster Office. And you had representation from various stakeholders within Barbados itself. So there was that sensitization that came about as a result of doing this. And Dr. Roper and my colleague Andrea and so forth would have been part and parcel of this initiative in terms of sensitization to the critical need to safeguard our cultural heritage. And this particular exercise exposed our first responders to the vulnerabilities that exist within our sector. And part of the seminar, part of this project within itself, we looked at the various disasters that would have taken place at the time. So we had colleagues from Antigua, colleagues from St. Lucia, who spoke to the various incidents that would have taken place at their repositories. And ironically, we would have had a simulation that would have taken place within March of 2024 at the archives within itself. But even before that simulation took place, there was a walkthrough with the fire officials. So they got an understanding of the records they had there. And from the feedback that I heard, they were surprised at some of the historic artifacts, the historic records that were actually housed within the department. And this in itself also helped in the recovery process to an extent, because they had that awareness, they had that sensitization. And it's not just the fire officers, but also the police and our Barbados Defense Force and so forth, who would have been part and parcel of this initiative, and also our DEM. So this was the aftermath. So this picture that I have here shows the aftermath of the fire within the archives. It was quite jarring. When we got there in the morning, because so as a cultural first aider, part and parcel of my remit would be to, once invited, to go onto the scene to see what can be salvaged, even sometimes during times of crisis. But what needs to be underscored is to ensure that human life comes above all else. We may have a notion, yes, we want to save as much things as possible, but at the end of the day, care and attention should be placed on human life in instances such as these. So the fire of respondents having had sensitization and having an awareness of the nature of the records actually held in the archives would have, in many instances, they would have going into the fire within itself. They would have gone in and retrieved some materials. So some materials were salvaged even while the fire was smoldering, while they were inside the space. So what happened? So that in itself was it was telling, because they took the due care and attention to actually see what they could save. And this helped significantly. So we had intervention from our archive staff, the staff at the archives itself, the Barbados Department of Archives, because having that type of intervention is necessary because no one knows the records or even the building better than the staff who actually work there. We had teams from conservation, and you had the cultural first aider intervention as well, as part and parcel of this exercise. So what we did, so we were split up in teams. So I oversaw the bagging and tagging of the materials that were retrieved from the fire within itself while it was smoldering on that fateful day. And my colleague in conservation, Anne Bancroft, would have also done some of the retrieval and the bagging, and just ensuring that those who were there to assist, we would go through the right protocols in terms of bagging and tagging of the materials and to be sent to cold storage so that further conservation interventions could be taken place. So it involves a lot in terms of recording information, and it's a very tiring process. It's also a painstaking one, in that you're viewing a place where you spend the majority of your day, and seeing that go up in flames. It's not a very nice experience. And even being up at the University of the West Indies and the Barbados Department of Archives, or the National Archives, being our neighbors and us having a close relationship with them, it was quite a jarring experience for me, seeing this building go up in smoke and the records go up in smoke. Okay. So we had 3 teams. We have 3 teams that are there that were put to assist with the records. So what was suggested by my colleague at the museum, Mr. Kevin Farmer, was to ensure that a roof structure was put onto the building, and that was done after a lot of the debris was taken out, because the roof would have caved in the building itself. So teams were put in place to do salvage efforts. So even before the roof was put on, there were instances, and even I have myself, a crane from the fire service was utilized, and a team of us actually went up into the crane to try to salvage as much records as we possibly could, wearing proper gear while doing this, and ensuring that, we have the proper masks or ventilation masks. We also wore the reusable hazmat suits, and having the proper footwear and gloves and so forth to actually be part of this. And having teams and segments of teams during a time such as this is very important, in that people would know their roles as it pertains to how you're going to be part of this recovery process. And ensuring that the team members that you have are aware of the risks involved in actually going into a space such as this. That's very important. It can be a very jarring experience. So one thing that I did, is even before we were given clearance by the fire officials to enter the building, was to ensure that the persons who would go in there with us would be aware of the risks, and they were able to do it. to conduct this exercise, also ensuring that there was no harm done to them, and ensuring that they also had no health risks as a result of, say, for instance, having something like asthma or any bronchial issues and so forth, because you're dealing with a fire. And what I must say and underscore is the teams are, you know, they're very persistent and very anxious to see in which ways they could actually help in terms of saving the records, because we had a small window in terms of, because you're talking about a very open environment, you're talking about water, and we live in the Caribbean, so temperature and humidity levels. So what could come as a result? Mold. So, and it only takes about 72 hours for that to actually kick in. So we did as much as we could in terms of salvage from that perspective.
All right, Halcyon, you only have a minute left.
Oh, okay, that went fast. Thank you. So being chair, the role of Kabika Chen within this, Kabika Chen, I'm just giving you an introduction here. The Cultural Heritage Emergency Network is a hub that functions under the auspices of the Cultural Emergency Response, which is out of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And Kabika Chen, or the Cultural Heritage Emergency Network, is one of the most recent hub to be part of this. So our role is to help or to lend assistance, to render aid as much as we can, especially as it relates to supplies and so forth, and even expertise within the sector, within the region, to see how we, so just to go out there and assist as much as we possibly could. My colleague Rita will be speaking more to that. So I guess the questions will come after, but I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Andrea.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're hearing me clearly. I want to thank the organizers for, 1 second, just moving my slides. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to present here. Are you seeing my slides?
Yes, we
Yes.
are.
Okay, great. And you're seeing it in the presentation mode, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So today we're gonna, my presentation is essentially going to be a journey through pre-disaster planning to post-disaster assessment, which is the link that connects pre-disaster planning to recovery in the heritage sector in the Caribbean, with our aim being to ensure stronger recovery. In 2022, just to get things started, UNESCO did this study using a group of original consultants to did this study on disaster resilience and recovery in the Caribbean's culture sector. It was meant to be a situational analysis to develop a plan of action that would be presented to the Council of Culture Ministers at CARICOM for them to have improved work done in the culture sector to ensure a more robust recovery post-disaster. That is still pending at that level. However, I just wanted to highlight that we did a survey across the region. We worked with 21 countries across the region. And in that survey, it was determined that 21.5% said that we're doing no disaster planning or risk planning for their sector, their museum, cultural space, whatever it might be. 36 said absolutely nothing was taking place, and a larger percentage said they were unsure if anything was taking place, or even if they were doing any form of collaboration with persons in the disaster section. And I think that this is a jarring thing for our sector because it shows that we need to do more integrated work with other areas of society. We cannot tackle disasters in the culture sector in the region only internally. I wanted to start with pre-disaster planning and to stress the importance of pre-disaster recovery planning in the culture sector. So this is essentially a proactive process of foreseeing potential recovery problems and creating a scenario-based recovery plan and strengthening the ability to enhance recovery results. So we want to ensure that, we have our annual tropical cyclone season. We want to ensure that if we have more robust pre-disaster planning, we will have robust recovery as well, or certainly recovery that's not so complicated for us in the region. As we know that our culture sector is already within the context of limited resources, and we already have the intersections between disaster management and culture being very poor at the regional level. However, in recent years, what we're seeing is that more and more institutions are realizing that the importance of having disaster planning, either for their museum spaces, for their archaeological sites. This unfortunately is not the norm as yet across the region, but we hope to get there. But for this integration to be better realized at the recovery stage, we need to take important actions in the pre-disaster phase. Policy, whether it be policy planning and programming, we need to ensure that actions which acknowledge the importance of this relationship, that they are put in place. So for many of the countries across our region, our pre-disaster baseline is that we don't even have, some places do not have inventories. We do not know the state of our collections or our sites. There is insufficient maintenance taking place with our historic buildings. Even in the case of the incident of the fire at the archives, it was in March that they were just putting in place fire wardens, so we need to know what our baseline situation is when if we're to move towards having a very good recovery process. So think about our DRM plan. What are the actions that we need to put in place in order to have this change effected? So when we think of our baseline data, it's a very important starting point because this data helps us to compare what the situation is after. Not only does it help us with that situation, but it contributes to the vulnerability and analysis that we need to do with the country. And we also are able to better understand the risks which are taking place. It will also give us an overview of the affected area. And I want to pause just to say that even though my presentation focuses on archaeological and built heritage and movable heritage, we know that the culture sector is much broader. We have intangible heritage, we have the creative sector, we even have cultural administration to think about in times of disasters. So for our pre-disaster planning, it does not mean that because we're planning, it means that it will diminish what needs to take place with post-disaster. Everything is complementary. So it is instead a step that leads to recovery that will make sure it's better for all parties. So when you think about your post-disaster recovery planning, I put it into three main components. You develop your goals, your objectives, and strategies for post-disaster recovery based on whatever disaster scenario you have in your particular island. You create a recovery structure that assigns post-disaster roles and responsibilities, and you're planning and implementing pre-disaster actions that will expedite and strengthen post-disaster planning and implementation. Now, it's good to have actions developed for each cycle of each part of the disaster management cycle. So, I mean, the examples I've suggested here are by no means the complete list. I've just put in some suggestions of some of the things that you can think about along each line of each part of the cycle. So in preparedness, which is where a lot of our work will take place, you can think about whatever is training that you need for your staff, what plan needs to be developed, what inventories and so on need to be put in place. And you need to think about funding as well. You know, where will you reach out to for funding when there's a disaster situation declared and your collection, for example, has been impacted significantly. So you really need to think about these things, and something that we really need to start actioning significantly in the region. Procurement issues. Do you know where you will get things from when there's a disaster situation, and what sort of relationships can you or partnerships can you establish in advance that will support you accessing these materials, for example, when you have a disaster situation or in a post-disaster situation. So think about the different actions. Maybe try and implement 2 to 3. Start with 1 year. You try to identify a key action that you're going to implement for each phase, and then you work on that. But if you're starting from a position, ground level, you know, you need to think about, you know, what are the actions that you need to have in place. And recovery, you know, think about when we're restoring our buildings, when we're having, do we have the persons who are going to be able to do these recovery actions, to do damage assessments? You know, we really have to think about these things. What if we, for example, we have all our collections at sea level in a particular town, you know, this moves from recovery action to something in preparedness, where you think about the next hazard that will come up, which will likely be a disaster. You know, do you need to move your collections in advance? You know, where can you secure your collections? These are very important things that we need to think about for the future, well, for the present and for the future. So when we're undertaking post-disaster assessment of heritage, we are really encouraging that we move away from focusing only on how your collection is impacted, how your archaeological site is impacted, how your built heritage is impacted, and think of impacts in a much more holistic way to look at your losses as well. So we have the different areas: your physical assets and infrastructure, you have service delivery, access to goods and services, the new risks and vulnerabilities that come up, governance and decision-making processes. If we should look at how, for example, the different types of heritage might be impacted when we have, for example, a tropical cyclone, you can either have destruction of buildings, you can have your cultural objects being damaged or total loss of them. You can have disruption in the practice of intangible heritage elements. Persons working in the cultural industries might no longer have access to resources. And when you're looking at cultural administration, how are the government buildings, or not even the government buildings, the persons, because in some countries it's NGOs who do a lot of the work in the culture sector. You know, how much have you been impacted administratively to be able to continue your work? You know, so we need to think about, have a more holistic view of how we're how the sector is impacted. So in saying that, we need to move beyond only looking at the damage, so the damage might be, you know, lack of access to something, but when we're looking at losses as well, and you know, these are terms, you don't even have to use them. We just want you to think about the losses in the culture sector. You know, persons not being able to visit your museum anymore. What is the loss of revenue for the museum space as well? Have persons lost their jobs as a result of your museum not being open? Were community people using your compound to earn a living? Were artisans working from that space? You know, what are the costs associated with cleaning up after the damage? You know, those are all part of when you're talking about damage and loss in the culture sector. If you have an archive and your reading room is totally flooded, Have you had to create a new space or persons to be able to access the collections that you have there? So think beyond only looking at what the immediate impact is on your collection or your space, your heritage space, to looking at the ripple effects of this damage to the sector. Another thing you have to think about too is the new vulnerabilities that have come up. What are your collections safe? No. Is there a threat of vandalism? Are you going to have to hire new security or more security to protect your collections? All these are things that come up when we're doing the assessment of cultural heritage post-disaster. So when we look at built heritage, we look at the damaged physical assets. So you make a description of that, and you go as detailed as possible. Data is what we're looking for when we're dealing with assessments. What's the level of destruction? What are the repair and rehabilitation needs? What new vulnerabilities have come up? And what sort of economic data from visitors, revenue, staff, etc. How is that impacted? Then when you look at museums, or movable heritage, museums, repositories, you're describing the damage. What's the level of damage? What are the conservation needs? What expertise will you need? What are the new risks and vulnerabilities that have come up? For example, with storage, with accessibility, or even with new risks like mold, that termites or other things that have presented themselves as a result. You need to pay attention to these things in your assessment, because it's from your assessment that you're able to develop practical recovery actions that will help you should something come again to impact your collection, so you're more resilient. Again, you're looking at economic data as well, and what are your repair and recovery options for whatever you have to work on. When you think of intangible heritage, you look at how the traditions and practices have been impacted, and you can see their importance to community, size of affected community, what describe the impact. Is it just a temporary loss of something not being practiced? Is it resources that's not available? You also have to look at displacement of communities as well that are practicing certain elements. What are the recovery options and costs that you have to consider as a result of these impacts? And again, the new risks and vulnerabilities. And finally, looking at the cultural industries, how has the value chain been impacted? What are the changes in economic flows, decline in output and lower revenue, increased expenditures? Persons, sometimes artisans, they work from their home. If they've lost their home, they've essentially also lost their workspaces. That impacts their livelihood. And what's the market like for demand? Will persons be able to recover because there's a market? Will you need to think about, for example, a virtual marketplace if persons are no longer visiting an area and buying things, for example? So those are things you have to think about when you're doing the assessment to be able to.
1 minute.
Sorry? Oh, yeah, okay.
1 minute. One minute
Okay,
left.
all right. All right. So I did a case study here for focusing on the Carriacou Historical Society. I'm not going to stay there, but I want you to reflect on, based on the points that I put forward for the case study earlier, what are the things that you would consider for any structure in your area or your collection, what you would think about if you were yourself doing an assessment. When we think of recovery planning, restoring pre-disaster baseline, identify weaknesses and gaps, prioritize recovery actions. You always need to think about your next step to make sure that whatever you're doing is not wasted or your resources are not wasted. You have to plan ahead, okay? When you're thinking about recovery in the culture sector, you always have to think about first aid measures, conservation actions and infrastructure. You need to think about how to get the culture sector going again, how to get your museum space going again, your archive going again, and how you can make sure that the next impact that you experience does not set you back, So your priorities might be you need to consider retrofitting your buildings differently, adjusting building codes, develop the risk management plans, think about use of technology. You know, we don't depend on technology a lot. We don't utilize this a lot in the region, but how can we bring technology in to better safeguard our collections? When you're thinking about movable heritage, do you need to, what principles and tools do you need to put in place? How are you going to approach disaster risk management and evacuation plans? And again, technology and innovation. So going back to the case study with the Carriacou Historical Museum Society, you know, what would their recovery priorities be? Is it a government versus a non-government? What would be the new risk? You see that the building is how it has been destroyed from what it was before. You know, think about what their recovery priorities would be. You can drop something in the chat or pose a question in relation to that later on. And then I'd just like to close by sharing some resources that when the presentation is shared with you, they have the links with them embedded, so you'll be able to access them easily, where you can get access to tools that can help you to do your own assessments, just provide more insight into the sort of data you need to collect to make your recovery stronger based on whatever it's your sector, or your cultural heritage site, or museum, or gallery space, archive, whatever it is. You will be able to better plan for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Rita, please feel free to proceed.
Thank you, Shani. Let me see.
Rita, remember to switch to presenter mode.
Okay. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you again, and good afternoon, colleagues. First of all, I want to thank the Board of the Museum Association of the Caribbean for organizing this webinar in collaboration or in partnership with the Caribbean branch of the International Council on Archives. My name is Rita Chinfu. I'm the co-chair of the Caribbean branch of, in short, I'm the co-chair of CHEN. And today I will be introducing the regional hub of CER in the Caribbean. CER is the acronym of the Caribbean the Culture Emergency Response. So with regards to CARBICA CHEN, CHEN was launched in 2019 after the hurricane Irma, Maria, and Jose struck the Caribbean. And in fact, that moment, that period was for us as CARBICAN important moment, because we realized that the Heritage Professional Association has to collaborate with each other, for instance, with regard to expertise, sharing scarce resources, and so on. We launched the CHEN in 2019 in Suriname, and between 2019 and 2023, we've been reaching out to the regional organization. For instance, the UNESCO Cluster Office in Kingston International. We reach out to the UNESCO Member of the World, to funding organization in Europe, for instance, Gerda Henkel Stichting, Prince Claus Funds, and so on. We even took part in workshops, in leadership training, and so on. And having said that, we reach out also to the Prince Claus Fund and the Smithsonian Culture Heritage Initiative, the SCRIBE. And at that time, that was in 2022, the Prince Claus Funds reached out to Chen, and we started to the discussion of having a SARE hub in the Caribbean. So what the SARE hub is, I will address that briefly. But first of all, this SARE hub was launched early this year in March 2024 in Willemstad, Curaçao. And on the photo, you see the representative of the professional association in the Caribbean. For instance, we had the MEC, a Curial representative from Built Heritage and Tangible Heritage, and so on. Because as I mentioned before, for us as CARB-CACHEN, it's imperative to collaborate with each other, because looking at the vulnerable state of our heritage sector in the region, year after year, challenged by various natural disasters, we have to do something. Sitting back and waiting for a disaster to happen is not an option anymore. And as Andrea just mentioned, we have to think about pre-planning. What can we do before a disaster hit us? So basically, this hub will become the regional center for coordinating culture emergency response during crisis and for facilitating preparedness and heritage protection capacity during times of calm. And our objective mainly is to create and enhance regional infrastructure that protect damaged or endangered heritage, tangible or intangible, during emergency situation. And how do we want to reach this objective? In close collaboration with you all, colleagues here in the region. We will focus on protecting heritage site, museum, collection, libraries, and archives. But before I go further into my next slide, I just want to emphasize we are not going to be able to reach these objectives if we are going to work alone. We have to collaborate with each other. So what is the culture emergency response? The SARE was, our PCF, Prince Claus Funds, was established in 2003 as a program. And in July 2022, the culture emergency response continued as an independent NGO. They support civil society initiative. They work from a bottom-up approach, and they have a connected role, bringing together multidisciplinary professionals. And what SARE provides is a fast, flexible financial support to locally led protection of heritage on the threat. I add the link to the SARE website on my slide. So the regional hub in the Caribbean, it is a 4-year program conducted by CARB-CACHEN. And what we want to do is to establish a regional hub of SARE in our region and to facilitate safeguarding heritage site, museum, archives, libraries, and so on. And what we want to achieve is also creating 3 or 4 sub-hubs in the region, strategically spread throughout the region as safe havens, storage repository for response and recovery goods, training and expertise center for preparedness and mitigation. In short, this regional hub will function as a go-to culture emergency response center in the region. That's why it's important to join hands. So looking at our activities for the next 4 years, we have the establishment phase. And in the first year, what we want to do is establish an organizational structure. So the secretariat has already been established and is based in Curaçao at the National Archives of Curaçao with my colleague, the director of the National Archives, Max Kriwanek. Also conducting or instituting comprehensive mapping and promoting awareness. This is a mapping workshop, a mapping tool we can use to identify heritage institution, identify the risks, and so on. In fact, when we organized the regional advocacy meeting in Curaçao, we also conducted a mapping workshop for the participants. So this is the establishment phase. And what we also want to do in the first year, 2024, 2025, is also to establish 3 or 4 shop hubs. I'm a bit positive, and in that sense, as Karbika Chen, as one of the co-chair, what we want to do is at least establish 1 sub-hub this year in the region. Looking at phase 2, sustainability, we're going to build regional capacity via multi-level training course and implementing and coordinating emergency response with the assistance and support of the UNESCO Cluster Office in Kingston, also with the SER and other organizations. We're going to start a training program in the region with regards to disaster preparedness or workshop on working with the mapping tool and so on. In fact, initially, we thought of the training course on first aid for culture, heritage, and crisis effect training, similar to ICROM, but we have to discuss if this is feasible or not. In phase 2, with regards to sustainability, and this is the challenging part, is to set up a mobile unit and preferably on the islands where the sub-hubs are located. And this mobile unit will consist of material, conservation material, and other material we need before or post disaster on each island. So if we have 3 or 4 sub-hubs, for instance, one in Barbados, one in St. Martin, the other in the Northern Caribbean and other places, this mobile lab will be stationed on the island. This is the last phase of the sustainability. And phase 3, that's also challenging. How will we maintain this hub in the region? And for that, we have to naturally collaborate with each other. We need commitment from the partners, and we have to discuss who will be responsible for the sub-hub and the regional hub at the end of the day. So I already mentioned that what we want to do this year. We already established the secretariat based in Curaçao. We also established part of the steering committee, and the steering committee of the regional hub consists of representatives from different geographical areas, island languages, and also a diversity of heritage style. Furthermore, what we want to do this year is at least create or establish 1 sub-hub. if people are interested, colleagues are interested, we can share the criteria with you all later. And for this year, what we also want to do is to organize mapping workshop in the region. We are now seeking for volunteers in the region where we can organize this workshop delivered by the Culture Heritage Monitoring Lab from the Virginia Museum of Natural History. And this CHML, they provide the global modeling and monitoring capability for culture heritage site threatened by armed conflict and natural disasters. So the volunteers per island for this mapping exercise. Before going into that, I just want to share with you that Karbika Chen organized or circulated a survey between November 23 and March 2024. And this survey was designed to elicit information on the level of disaster preparedness and heritage protection in the region. And only 53% of the respondents mentioned that they didn't have an updated disaster management plan. And basically, more or less, Andrea already addressed this. More than half our heritage institution, heritage professionals in the region are not prepared for a disaster. So this is something we have to work on and to think about in the coming months and very soon also. So the objective of this planning tool workshop is to increase regional hub preparedness for responding to disasters events. And the map can function as a monitoring and alerting tool. This is needed for disaster management organization. They can use it because it's an open source, it's layered also, and it's easier to include heritage in national disaster plan with this tool. And what can we map? So the focal points or the volunteers from each island are advised to map heritage site, stakeholders, the risks, and the infrastructure.
Sorry, 1 minute.
Oh, okay. So we can go into this. This is the mapping workshop. If I click here, then, oh, sorry. Let's see. Okay, heritage under threat, what to do in case of an emergency. So this was Dominica, and the other one is I think it was in St. Martin. And in case of a disaster, and you need assistance, first of all, you have to make sure that you are safe, your staff, family, and yourself. Second, what you can do is reach out to us, the regional hub or the sub-hub coordinators or vice versa. Complete a situation analysis document and submit it to us, to the regional hub coordinators. And then the situation analysis document, you can add information on the situation, what the damages are, your urgent needs and priorities, and also a customized or an itemized budget to cover the needs. And the SARE can provide you with support to recover your collection. I have to emphasize that this is a first aid recovery, is to stabilize the situation, no repair or restoration yet. and it's about saving the collection immediately. So as one of my colleagues in the region said, we need to get our house in order. We face constant risks in the region, and we cannot sit and wait for the next disaster to happen. What we need, as Karbika Chen, we need volunteers per island for this mapping exercise. We need islands who are willing to host or maintain a sub-hub. And also, we have to adopt international standard, geolocate local heritage, and include heritage in the National Disaster Response Plan. So colleagues, people, let's get to work. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, colleagues, this was a very, very informative session. So, generally speaking, we normally ask people to put their comments in the chat. However, we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So in this section, you can also just raise your hand and we allow you to unmute. And we just ask that you introduce yourself and the organization that you work with or country that you're in. And we ask, okay, sorry. And we ask that you, introduce yourself, country and or organization that you're working with, and that you keep your questions brief. Right. Alex, please chip in here for questions in the chat.
I'm seeing a question from Michelle Springer from the ICH with the National Cultural Foundation in Barbados. And her question to the presenters is, how do we incorporate, my apologies, ICH in our DRR protocols? Michelle, could you just type out what those various acronyms mean in the chat, just so that everyone's clear? Or unmute?
So I think for ICH, she means intangible cultural heritage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and DRR, disaster risk recovery.
Disaster recovery, okay.
Okay, yeah, she did tap in the chat.
I could-
Andrea, answer?
Yeah, I can jump in. Hi, Michelle. So with intangible heritage, that is one of the areas that they've acknowledged is one of the most difficult areas to incorporate in disaster risk reduction, even though, you know, the scholarship out there is suggesting more and more that more countries are using intangible heritage, you know, whether it's your local knowledge or whether it's the practices that you have from the past that that are relevant to disaster risk. In the Caribbean, unfortunately, it's still limited. However, there are some countries that are trying to make strides in relation to agricultural practices in managing drought conditions and dealing with pests and other issues. As to how to get it more integrated into our protocols, well, one, you already see that the culture sector is limited in its in being integrated in DRR protocols in many of our countries. One way we can start to do it is we can probably start to have actions that look at how this data can be integrated into the DRR protocol. So whether it's either we develop indicators, for example, and how this can be monitored in these processes. But that is something that has to be led at, for example, a ministry level, trying to bring together all the partners in the different areas. The first place is working with your disaster management agency to see how these can be better integrated, and then maybe have a wider society approach to it, to where you're bringing in more stakeholders who can feed into a process and maybe get something going that is unique to your particular country.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrea. I don't know if Rita or Halcyon has something to add.
Yeah, I guess I could add to what Andrea's been saying. Additionally, from the regional perspective, we've also engaged the likes of SEDIMA as part of this initiative too. So looking at getting the orange sector, so to speak, the cultural heritage sector, as part of, on their radar. And we've made those strides, and hopefully, it's quite fruitful, and that we can be part of the emergency initiatives as well.
All right, so I think we have some interest. Belize is volunteering to be a part from Margaret Ventura to be a part of the mapping component. Karen is a consultant from Mexico. And the question was about if Cancun or Quintana Roo, where the Cancun is located, can be included. And that's Rita responded to that. Okay, Nadine Modestin, which I may be speaking, not saying it correctly. Should be delighted to connect with cultural professionals in the Caribbean to support outreach efforts in the Francophone Caribbean, and she's put her information there as well. Let me see, we have quite a few of Foundation Culture Creation, but Ventures Horrible. Okay, hold on. Let's see. Right, and SEDIMA is working with UNESCO to get culture better integrated generally. Do we have any other questions? All right, so Halcyon, I have a question for you. In terms of one, well, it's more a statement because you didn't mention that Barbados, that Beryl passed Barbados as a hurricane shortly after the fire. So could you just talk a little bit about, just very briefly, to handling, navigating multiple climate disasters in a moment of crisis, and
Right.
probably 1 or 2 pointers.
So that's actually a good statement, because the roof went on in record time on the archives within itself. And if more water would, ingress of water would have actually gotten into the building, it would have been worse. So putting all those mitigations in place, and whenever you have a hurricane or a storm that is pending or approaching, that's one disaster you could try to prepare for as best as you possibly can, because it's forecasted and you can work accordingly. With other hazards, some of them you can't predict, like an earthquake, for instance. But with but there was no major impact in any way, form, or fashion to the sites as a result of Beryl's passage. That's for the archives, but the fisheries sector in Barbados was severely impacted as a result of the passage of Beryl. And these are the aspects of, and people may think fisheries, but aspects of fisheries, it could be, it's considered part of, our cultural heritage as well, because, and if not taken, if steps aren't taken to, you know, try to ensure that these practices are still carried out and still carried on over time, we can have serious implications for various industries, because that in itself is a skill. It's a cultural asset. Just to give credence to that.
All right, thank you so much. Andrea, you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, that truck was just passing. Yeah, I wanted us to, following on from what Halcyon said, because we really need to remember, this is why pre-disaster planning is so important. And I don't want us to be caught up in a situation like, for example, with, we know that when Maria was hitting Dominica, that how quickly that progressed from being a category 1 or 3 star, and then it skipped several steps and became a 5. And you know, persons would have gone home or whatever. So this is why pre-disaster planning is really important. We also know that in the region that sometimes the storms tend to follow a particular track each year. I'm not saying this is proven in data, but we have seen this happen in the past already, where the storms, we see how many storms went up to Bermuda, for example, in the last hurricane season. You know, so we need to pay attention and make some really sound observations for ourselves in the region. When Barbados was impacted by Elsa, that was within the context also. There was still some recovery going on in relation to the eruption from La Soufrière. So we all have multiple hazard situations dealing with sometimes. So just leaving everything for recovery just won't cut it for us moving forward, because things are projected to be more intense and to get worse. That's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And I see that there's some continued chatter happening in the discussion. Various folks are exchanging information, which is really great to see. I know there's, oh, you're muted, Shani.
Oh, sorry. Everybody's sharing their contact information, and the meeting is being recorded. So if necessary, we can pull it for our colleagues at Caribbean Chen. But just a follow-up question for Andrea or for Rita. Andrea, what, in your own experience, what have you seen to be some of the pitfalls in the post-disaster recovery process in terms of doing a situational analysis? And for Rita, I think you did say it in your chat, in your presentation, but if you could just affirm again for us what CER could absolutely fund in the immediate term, and probably between yourself and Andrea, what are some of the things that we may need to consider budgetary wise when planning, doing our pre-disaster plans for what could happen in impact, or it may be things that people have forgotten. If you could just add those two things between the two of you. Thanks.
Rita, do you want to go first? Or
Yes, thank you, Shani, for your question. Yes, I mentioned it in my presentation, but I want to emphasize this again. So the Culture Emergency Response program, we can support institutions, island, post-disaster with their recovery. And this aid is to stabilize the situation. We're not going to repair, for instance, a roof or build a new repository. The aid or the assistance, financial aid or conservation material will be granted after you submit the situation analysis. And it's about saving the collection immediately. And if you need more assistance after the first aid support, then CER can also support or assist to look for funding elsewhere because they have a large network. For instance, funding organization like ALIF and other organization. And I mentioned it also, because they have a large network, they can connect us with other funding organization, but also training institution, for instance, like the monitoring lab in Virginia, and so on. So this is very important for us because after the passage of Hurricane Beryl, we also reach out to our colleagues in Barbados. We reach out to Grenada, to St. Lucia, just to find out if they need help from us. So yes, I hope I could clarify your question, Shani.
Yes, absolutely. Andrea, just about things that some of the more pointed things that you realize that a lot of organizations leave out in their post-situational analysis, and also some considerations that people should think about for budgets when it comes on to disaster planning, pre-disaster stage.
Okay, well, in relation to the assessments, a lot of persons or institutions sometimes underestimate the resources that they will need. For example, or they don't have funds to even do all the assessments that they need to do, or immediate actions that might need to be put in place. So for example, you know that if after your collection has just been exposed to a flooding situation, they don't really have the human resources to call on. The persons who work in the museum sometimes cannot do the first aid, or have conservation persons that they can call on. So even if it's like a volunteer situation, but they need to think about what skill sets they will need should they be impacted, and this can really delay the process with recovery. So for those are the things for the immediate actions. When they're doing the assessments, I had mentioned this in my presentation, persons tend to only focus on the damage that they can see. And it needs to be extended more to look at what sort of risks and vulnerabilities are coming up. You know, for example, how if your collections have become insecure and exposed to certain things, you need to think about those things and what you need to do to make sure that they're secure. In terms of funding, in follow-up to what Rita said about CER, the Cultural Emergency Response, yeah, there are some other places out there that funding is available. I would even ask if we don't have the time, but something that Barbados is doing, they have recently started to, where their disaster management office is trying to include culture in their country work program for CDEMA. And that provides some opportunities also for us in the region to look at that as one way, and perhaps for some additional funds to come our way that might not be international funds, because international funds can sometimes be a very long process. Some make room for a very quick deployment of funds. Another option is the Heritage Emergency Fund under UNESCO. That's one other place that the funding is available, that you can quickly make the application. The application is not complicated. And I was also speaking to some colleagues in some of the other international programs that don't really focus on the Caribbean region. And they said they don't really focus on the Caribbean region because we're classified as higher income countries. And so the funds are not necessarily there, but we understand our situation and we know what happens in the culture sector with trying to get funds for pre-disaster planning. I would say identify the actions that that can make your recovery more robust. So if you need to get the data you need about how you're being impacted, if you need to do a multi-hazard risk situation analysis, if you need to identify resource persons, whatever you can put in place and identify the funds to put those things in place in the beginning, I think that would be funds well spent for your organization.
Thank you, Andrea. I know that we're coming up on time, but I just want to squeeze in maybe one final question coming from Godson Antoine, who is a heritage restorer and member of MAC. He's saying, and I'm working from an English translation, so I hope that this is close enough, Antoine. Thank you for putting that in there. He is a heritage restorer and member of MAC. And he's essentially asking, you know, whether the intermediaries, so the protectors, the rescuers, persons such as yourselves that are doing this work, if we need to strictly adhere to the codes of ethics and professional conduct of international cultural organizations, in this case relating to hurricanes and other disasters. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Antoine, but I think what he's asking is if the same quote unquote best practices that apply internationally must rigorously be applied to and adhered to at all times in the Caribbean region, understanding that there may be some nuances with the types of challenges that we face.
Maybe Halcyon or Andrea can answer this. Yeah.
So one thing I want to underscore, and this is something that was shared by a colleague in Lebanon recently. Sometimes depending on your situation, depending on your political situation, for instance, it may be very nuanced in terms of how you may actually, one, get funding, and two, get equipment and so on there for you. Yes, looking at the overarching best practices may be the way to go in the first instance, but it could be very nuanced and very challenging in certain areas, and as we could appreciate. And as cultural practitioners, and for us trying to save or to ensure that our cultural heritage pervades over time, we're under sometimes very dire circumstances, and sometimes we have to sometimes toe the line a little bit. And I've heard that from colleagues in Lebanon and also the Ukraine. So who have, as you all may be aware, the kind of circumstances that they experience. So sometimes it may mean getting some equipment in and not, you know, things like tops or plastic boxes and so forth to help cart things away, or to put them into safe storage, or even money is coming in to pay volunteers, because in some instances this may be some people's bread and butter, and just giving them a stipend to actually carry out the work as a way of, you know, telling them thank you for the initiatives and thank you for the work that you're carrying out. These things come to mind.
All right, colleagues, at this point, we had a hard stop at 12:30 my time, 1:30 Atlantic Standard Time. So as co-convener with my colleagues at Caribbean, I'm gonna take this opportunity to really just say this would not be possible without your attendance. We had very good registration and very good consistent attendance, and we just want to thank you all for your commitment to changing our practice in terms of heritage and disaster risk assessment and recovery. So I want to just say very quickly, I want to say thank you to our interpreters, Janina and Zaidi, who are doing, Janina who's doing English to French, and Zaidi is doing English to Spanish. I also want to thank our presenters. It's a small network of colleagues around the region, and this is really a commitment to working collaboratively, sharing resources, encouraging best practice. And I think in many ways, despite our limited infrastructure and our differing social, political, and cultural contexts, that I think it looks good for us in the region if we continue to do this kind of collaborative work and taking advantage of our networks and bringing information to the forefront. I want to thank Max tech person, Mr. Javier Bailey, who had to run, but he always comes through and saves us. I really also just want to thank my colleagues at Carabica Chen, who just this pioneering work and their willingness to just always collaborate with us, collaborate with institutions around the region. Please go ahead. You need to unmute.
Thank you very much, Shani, for this opportunity. As I said, it's a great effort to join forces and to work together with the archives and the museums. And just like Rita said, we have to work together. We have to find volunteers for this effort and to, work together to protect our collections and to better organize a response mechanism in the region. I hope this webinar was facilitating this. And thank you very much for the cooperation.
You're muted, Jenny.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so I want to thank everyone who's willing to be volunteers. Please feel free to reach out to Matt. And Rita and Max have also put their emails in. If you're absolutely willing to volunteer, please do so. And when we circulate the presentations and access to the video recording, that we would also include the relevant emails so that volunteers can reach out to Carabica Chen on their program. So I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank you for just being present, asking questions, participating, and we look forward to having you at more of Max webinars, Carabica's webinars, and whatever collaborative programs we will attempt to do in the future as joined resources. And I wish you all a great afternoon, and we keep safe for our colleagues who are in the path of Ernesto, I think it is, that's heading towards Bermuda. All right, thank you so much.